Mike Morris, who's in the front here getting prepped with his microphone. He's from Prince George. He's the MLA for Prince George-Mackenzie. He has a somewhat checkered past, being an MLA for starters. But he's also been an outdoorsman, a hunter, a trapper. He has been actually a trapper by profession. He's a conservationist. He's been an RCMP officer, an adjudicator on a health board, BC Solicitor General. But now he's a forest activist, and he's here to talk to us about his observations about how our current forest management is affecting wildlife, their habitats, and the biodiversity they rely on.
It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'd like to say that I'm also joined by one of my colleagues, Renee Merrifield, who is the MLA for Kelowna Mission. Right. Yeah. And Renee is also the critic for the environment for us, so she has done a lot of work in this area over the last little while. So it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm not an expert in basically anything. I've been around for a long time, I guess, and that kind of adds to the wisdom and the cracks around my eyes. My young grandson, I was heading to work here a number of years ago when my grandson was 5, and he said, "Granddad," he said, "what are all those cracks around your eyes?" And I looked at him and I said, "It's wisdom." And he said, "Oh, okay." And away he walked. And so it's wisdom is what he refers it to. So my baseline in the forests and the outdoors was a long time ago. I started school in 1959, and I've always been enamored with the outdoors. I started trapping at an early age. I hunted. I brought up my family on moose meat and elk and bear and grouse and the wild harvest. So the blueberries and the huckleberries and everything else that our wilderness has to offer in British Columbia. I was born in Quesnel. I went to 17 different schools in BC from grade 1 to 12, graduated in Salmon Arm, changed schools a lot. And that was because of my dad. He had a bit of a sordid past and was running from things for the most part. And then when I joined the RCMP, I finished high school in Salmon Arm, went to Manitoba, applied for the force, and I got back to BC, and Prince George was my first posting when I joined in 1973. So I've been able to maintain that outdoor lifestyle in the central interior of British Columbia ever since. And when I started in the outdoors, there was no clear-cut logging. It was select logging back in the day. We didn't start clear-cutting in British Columbia until the mid-1960s. And so up until about the 80s, you could still find a lot of the areas that had not been clear-cut logged yet. So my baseline for the population of wildlife, for the things that I see in the wilderness, the birds, the raptors, all of those things stem from the late 50s, early 60s, and throughout. And it wasn't until, I bought my first trap line in the early 1980s in the Fort St. James area. And I noticed a lot of the clear cuts materializing, the marten population going down. The moose population was still pretty good until we started spraying with glyphosate, and it started on a steady decrease as well. But it wasn't until the late 1990s, early 2000s, when I was involved with the BC Trappers Association on the executive, that we became very concerned about the cumulative impacts of resource development in the province. And so I went down and I met with the forest minister, and I met with the environment minister back in the early 2000s to express my concerns about the cumulative impact to the forests and the loss of wildlife. And I got the nods, and I got, okay, yeah, no, it's a concern. And but nothing ever happened. And the loss of the forest canopy, the loss of biodiversity increased significantly in the early 2000s. I'll go into that shortly. But it's always been a pressing concern for mine. So when I was asked in the early part of 2013, before the 2013 election, to run, my first response was to say no, but I didn't quite get it out. And my predecessor just said, take some time to think about it. And I did think about it, and I talked to family and friends about it. And but one of the pressing issues for me is I wanted to go inside that granite castle down in Victoria and find out where that big black hole was that things seemed to disappear. And so I did. And, you know, this has been, I'm not going to be running in the next election. It's been one of the most unique experiences I think anybody can have, is to run for public office and to become a politician, but stay focused on what your core principles and values are as you go through that process. And that's tough. That's tough to get it out there, because politics always plays a role in what we say and what we do out there. So, you know, and I've been very fortunate by, I've been silenced to a degree when we were in government, of course, that let the minister do whatever they do. And I was a minister, and I know what we do is essential. And it's 7 days a week, 24-hour-a-day work. It's relentless, the amount of work that a minister has in any government. And it wasn't until we got into opposition that I was able to kind of raise my head up and speak a little bit more and see some of the things that we had done wrong in government that reflected on the loss of biodiversity and the cumulative impacts of resource development in the province. I was really fortunate when Kevin Falcon came on as our leader. He has given me carte blanche to go out and speak about it, get it on the record, speak passionately about it in the House as well, which is exactly what I've been doing. Many of you have seen my Facebook posts. You've seen a lot of the stuff I have out there. And I attribute a lot of that to Kevin giving me the freedom and the latitude to say those things that I feel is important that we need to say out there. And my colleagues get to hear it all the time from me. And so it's nothing new to my colleagues as well. But I'm going to go back in time here just a little bit to when I first took notice of this. I was concerned, like I said, as a trapper, the loss of biodiversity, the cumulative impacts of resource development. And when I got into government, I spoke about this. I made a presentation. I've made presentations every year since I got elected in 2013 on the loss of biodiversity. And Christy Clark called me in one day and she said, I'm going to appoint you as the Minister of State for Forestry. And or Parliamentary Secretary to Forestry, which is basically the same thing. And I want you to do a review on wildlife habitat in the province of British Columbia. Great, right up my alley. So that's exactly what I did. So I took a year in 2013, 2014 to do that. And I had a chance to travel the entire province. I looked at the oil and gas sector. I looked at mining. I looked at forestry. I looked at everything. And when I concluded, you know, I was a little naive when I stepped into that role, really thinking that a lot of the loss of biodiversity and the cumulative impacts were in the Prince George timber supply area. It's the largest one in BC. It contributes and has contributed about 40% of BC's softwood volume year over year. And so I thought, okay, it's just in the Prince George area. But once I got up in that helicopter and traveled the province, I realized that it was impacting every bit of this province, everywhere I went. And I was quite concerned over that. And I made a presentation to the Council of Forest Industries in early 2015 to advise them of the results of my review of wildlife habitat in the province. And I said, you know, I had looked at the entire area. I had looked at the forest stewardship plans. I had reviewed every piece of legislation that supported forestry in the province and read it. And my background, I spent 32 years as a police officer, criminal investigator. So as I said, I'm not an expert, but I know how to dig into things and do an investigation to find out where things went off the rails. When I read the Forest and Range Practices Act, which came in the early 2000s, when I first read it, I couldn't believe what I was reading because it looked like it was written by industry. So I went back and I read it again, and I was still convinced it was written by industry. And the regulations were very biased towards industry. And I was quite concerned about that. So when I made my presentation to the Council of Forest Industries, I said, you know, I've read your forest stewardship plans. They've been written by a professional forester. There's no doubt in my mind, but they've been sanitized by corporate lawyers so that there's nothing that can be done. And adding to the problem that I saw as a seasoned veteran law enforcement officer, there was nothing in the legislation that could be done to prevent the forest industry from taking over the sector like they did. And it turbocharged the forest sector. And instead of seeing a reduction of loss of habitat, we saw more and more and more all the time. And of course, we're still involved in that. So I said at this particular meeting that you guys are in control of our forests. And if you don't pull back on the throttle and start cutting half of what you're cutting today, we're going to be out of harvestable trees within the next 8 to 10 years. And here we are. We're out of harvestable trees in that 8 to 10 year period of time. And of course, they were very upset with me for saying that. And I went back the following Monday morning and I went into Christy Clark's office and I said, Christy, I said, you're probably going to be getting some phone calls. And she kind of smiled and she said, I already have. And I said, what do you want me to do? And she said, Mike, she said, nobody has done this before. Keep on doing what you're doing because we need to hear that other part of the story. And so I did. But unfortunately, a few months later, I was asked to take over the role of the Solicitor General. And I really hummed and hawed over that one thinking, should I do that or shouldn't I do that? Because my heart was in biodiversity and forestry and all the other things that are associated with that. But I did. I took that role and it was a good experience. I had it for a couple of years before the election of 2017. But you're so focused on your role as a minister that you can't delve into anything else. So the election came and we won, but because of the agreement with the Greens, the NDP ended up forming government. But I think that was a good thing in my view, because it gave me that opportunity to get out of that rut that we were in and see that we can be doing things differently. And that's what I've been trying to push for, is to do things differently on the biodiversity forestry side. But when you're dealing with decades and decades and 3 and 4 generation families that have been involved in the forest sector, and it's been very good for British Columbia. It's created billionaires, as one of my friends told me a few years ago. But it's provided a good income, and it's been very good for British Columbia from an economic perspective. We started off in 1945 in the direction of a sustainable forest yield that was given to us by the Royal Commission on Forestry in the early 1940s, and the report came out in 1945, and recommending to government that we will adopt the sustainable yield strategy in British Columbia. And the commissioner in his report, and I went through the entire report. I've read all the Royal Commissions, by the way, and all the supporting information that they have on that. But the commissioner noted that British Columbia has a lot of wood, and there are other values on the land base with respect to water and biodiversity and all those other good things that we all know. But because BC has so much forest, we don't have to worry about that because it'll grow back quick and we can't log it to have any real major impact on that. And I think that's where the wheels fell off back in 1945. And it created this myopic focus on a forest strategy solely focused on fiber and the value of wood products, that it omitted every other value on the land. And it's taken a while because we did have so many trees. And of course, back in those days, a cycle was 120 years. People can't think of 120 years. We think in contemporary time of a human life. So by the time I'm old, everything should be up and growing again, and my kids can get involved in that, and life carries on. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It takes centuries for those trees to grow back to the same capacity that they were before and provide that same biodiversity that we need for all the wildlife. And that's not happening. So we have gone into this. And of course, when we turbocharged the forest sector, about the same time the pine beetle came on. And my observations, a lot of what I'm saying tonight, in fact, most of what I'm saying tonight is based on my own observations. The forest industry, in the Prince George timber supply area, they put in soft partitions saying, when you guys go out and cut a tree down, make sure it's dead. And we will give you a little bit on the side. So, 70% of your wood needs to be dead pine and 30% can be green. And in the entire Prince George timber supply area, they were saying 800,000 maximum, 800,000 cubic meters maximum out of, I think the cut had been boosted to about 14 million cubic meters at that particular time, can be green wood. So, but all the licensees were cutting 800,000 and that kind of went out the window. And that was our midterm timber supply. And that scared the hell out of me actually, because it was gone and it was going fast. And here we are today. So, and we've been practicing the clear cutting. So one of the questions, I had a group of individuals come in and meet me a couple of weeks ago. that have been involved in the forest sector and the workers and everybody else, and it's a good life. I asked this question, I've asked it before. What happens to the wildlife in the area that you're going to log? This block of primary forests that you're going to log, and it could be 100 hectares, it could be 200 hectares or bigger. What happens to the wildlife in it? And I left that pregnant pause and I looked, and the one gentleman put his hand up and he said, well, he said, they just go into the neighboring forest. And I said, yeah, they did at one time. You know, when we first started clear cutting in the 60s, they could do that. But there's 81 species of wildlife in British Columbia that den or nest in tree cavities. And those tree cavities are in trees that are 100, 200, 300, 400 years old. And a lot of them for the species that I've trapped with marten and fisher, but a lot of other species, those tree cavities are 30 feet off the ground. And there's lots of habitat around to protect that particular den. But when we go in and clear cut, they're gone. Every single tree cavity is gone, and they're down, and there's no place for those animals to go. The other thing, and you know, I've said this before, is I've put about 15,000 kilometers on my own personal truck in the last probably 7 or 8 years, driving into recently harvested areas, and recently means anything under about 20 years up in my neck of the woods, looking for stick nests, because that's where our raptors go. That's the owls will chase out the eagles and the hawks and take over these nests and use them for themselves. And I used to see lots of owls. I had great horned owls, gray owls, every kind of owl we had. I could sit on the deck of my cabin from about 4 o'clock in the evening on and hear those owls hooting all night long. I don't hear a sound anymore. And I don't see an owl anymore. They're gone. The same with the goshawks. I had goshawks all over the place. You just about had a name for every single one of them, and they're gone. So I looked for these stick nests. It's illegal under Section 34 of the Wildlife Act to cut down any stick nest that you come across. I didn't find one. I have not yet seen one stick nest that has been kept in any of those wildlife patches or any of the retention areas that we have. The other thing is that it's been common practice that if you did have a stick nest that you came across as a forester, you would put a retention area of about 100 meters around that particular stick nest, saying, okay, we've saved that stick nest. Recent research up in the Maurice River area out of Houston, and it was sponsored by Canfor. They hired some of these folks to do the job, a wildlife biologist, a forester, and other technician. They gave me a copy of their report that they did in 2021. And in that report, they were talking about 1,200 hectares per colony. So ma, pa, and the kids for the year. So, you know, the male, female, goshawk, and whatever nestlings that they would have for that year. It would take about 1,200 hectares to support that colony for the year. The research evolved over a couple of years, and now it's pretty definitive that they say it's 4,600 hectares to protect or necessary to support one colony. And the entire watershed, they felt at one time there was 430 to 450 colonies in that area. There's now 35, and they've got them all GPS and they know exactly where they are. So, and that information went forward to the regional executive director, and you know, saying this is what we need to consider, and it would have an impact on the AAC for that particular area. And it was determined that, you know, economically, we can't pay attention to that goshawk study because it's going to have such a drastic impact on the amount of timber available for harvest. And so it'll be interesting to see how things progress from that area. But that's how we have ignored the science. And Eunice Alila will be coming up later on to talk about some recent science that has me worried, but we have ignored the science. I can come up and I've probably got 100 studies on my home computer on fur bearers and animals and raptors on the habitat and the life cycles, and they're all written by RP bios and scientists and whatnot. And every single one of them says that habitat, the loss of habitat, is one of the largest mortality drivers that we have for wildlife. Once you lose the habitat, the wildlife is gone. And in many areas in British Columbia, it's extirpated. It's my observation from what I see in my area, and I've talked to other folks from around the province, so I think it holds true province-wide. I think our population of wildlife has been depleted by at least 50% or more because of loss of habitat. And many species are extirpated regionally, fisher, the raptors, and other animals. I don't see moose in the wild around my trap line very, very seldom. You know, before I could go in and out and there would be moose tracks over top of my tracks just about every trip I made in there. And they're gone because there's no habitat. There's nothing left for them to eat. We are planting our forest, replanting our forest, and we started in the 70s, but in the 80s we got some federal money to come in and help us out with that. But we've been planting monoculture, conifer, pine plantations in an area that were predominantly spruce and balsam prior to being harvested. And it breaks my heart to see that because it's different biodiversity. But we have gone in and glyphosated all the broadleaf plants in those areas. And that's biodiversity. That's the food for insects and habitat and redback voles and birds and everything else is a crucial part of the food chain, but it's not there. So you can go into an area that is solid monoculture lodgepole pine, and some areas are starting to show some spruce pine mixtures in there that are planted at 2,000 and 3,000 stems per hectare. They might have been planted at 2,000, but there's a little bit of natural regen that comes in there as well. You can't even walk through some of these plantations because they're so thick. But there's no habitat in there for the moose. There's no habitat in there for a lot of the birds. A lot of the insects that are required for the food chain don't come around unless there's deciduous trees and there's deciduous growth in there. So, you know, that's a major problem for us. And we need to change that direction sooner than later. We should have changed that 20 years ago, but we haven't. So we have, since we started clear cutting in the mid-1960s, we have clear cut about 20 million hectares of British Columbia. And, you know, 20 million hectares, you know, there's about 54 million hectares of vegetation across our province. So BC is about 94 million hectares in size. And so a good portion of British Columbia has already been logged in the last, you know, number of years since the mid-1960s. But we've been logging for 200 years in BC. So basically every bit of our 54 million hectares of British Columbia has been logged except for some of the more remote areas in Northwest BC and Northeast BC to a degree. Although Northeast BC, there's been a lot of cumulative impacts of resource development up there. So we have cut a lot down. So I came across an article written by the next speaker, Eunice Alila, on the loss of the forest canopy contributing to the increased frequency and magnitude of flooding in British Columbia. And that caught my attention. It was in a Forest Practices Board report from 2016. And I read those on a fairly regular basis to try and stay abreast on what's going on. And there's a lot of information in those. But it caused me to read back into some of the reports that Eunice and other researchers have done. And it struck me because the one report from 2012 or 2014, the researchers that was working with Eunice on this said in the southern interior of the province, it takes 80 years for a conifer tree to grow to a sufficient height where it'll start providing the level of protection that the ground needs so that we don't see the massive spring freshets we have from the snow melt, because there's nothing to protect the snow from melting. And I'm thinking, okay, 80 years in the southern interior. In my area, in the central interior and the high elevations, it could take 100, it could take 150 years for the tree to reach that height of the original forest. And when I stopped to think about it, that means that we have harvested 20 million hectares of forest in British Columbia that have not recovered sufficiently to protect the ground from adding to the frequency and magnitude of flooding that we have in the province. So combined with all of these things together, I am quite alarmed at the future that we have in British Columbia, and people really need to take this seriously. And leaders at all levels, doesn't matter whether it's a municipal politician, regional director, provincial, federal, I think everybody has to focus on this. And Eunice may not talk about this, but I will. Is that if I was a forest consultant, or I was a logger, or I was a forest company, or I was anybody within government that signed off on a document that said, go and cut some more trees down and cut some more of that canopy down, I would be looking over my shoulder to see how many lawyers were going to be walking down to say, you are responsible. Because when you look at it, we have lost lives because of flooding. We have had serious injuries, permanent damage, physical damage to people for the rest of their life as a result of flooding and wildfires. We have done billions of dollars of infrastructure damage in British Columbia as a result of the flooding and the wildfires. But also, we have billions of dollars of lost economic activity. When you see the Coquihalla shut down, when you see our railways shut down that we can't ship goods north, south, east, west out of British Columbia, that has a severe impact. And it's caused by the loss of the forest canopy. So the other part of that also causes me concern is when the ground dries out, no forest canopy, when the ground dries out, it increases the risk of wildfires that we see throughout the province here as well. And I've seen this. I didn't have the scientific background in order to do that, but I'm an investigator. I'm a cop. I kind of look at things, and when you see something that looks a little bit off, you investigate it and find out why it's like that. And if you need to find the scientist or the individual that can kind of put the meat on the bones for that, you go and look for that individual so you can present that to the decision makers. I always look at it like I'm testifying in court. Your Honor, this is what I found. This is the investigation, the results of my investigation. Here's my witnesses. If you want to listen to them, then you can make your determination of whether he's right or wrong, she's right or wrong, or whether the investigation that I did was adequate enough to change the dial. So we are at a nexus in British Columbia where all of these things are meeting now, where we've got climate change, where we've got the loss of forest cover, where we've got flooding, where we've got fires, we've got 50% loss of wildlife or more, which I think is catastrophic. This was my passion. And yet nobody seems to be worried enough to do anything about it at the end of the day. So that's the direction of a lot of the speeches that I've been making in the House, a lot of my 2-minute statements, a lot of my questioning to the ministers of force when the opportunity presents itself, or to the Minister of the Water, Air, and Land and Resource Stewardship. So the decision makers need to be seized with the information. And that's my, I guess, advice and direction is, you know, we can rally, we can pound our fists on the table, we can shout from the rooftop saying things need to change. But I think if we concentrated on making sure that the decision makers, whoever they might be, are seized with the correct information, then I think we'll start seeing that dial change as we move forward here. So it's, I'm starting to lose my voice here. I don't know how much more time I have here, but I think, you know, I appreciate everybody showing up here today. I've got a website called futureforouforest.ca. A lot of the reports, a lot of the studies that Eunice and his team from UBC have done are included on that as well. My speeches are included on that. I've got some videos on YouTube that include a lot of the narrative that I'm giving you here today as well. So we need to keep pushing, and I think we've got. You know, I certainly have the support of my caucus. We are a coalition party, and you don't push somebody out the door because they say something that nobody wants to hear. So Kevin has given me that ability to say this, and my caucus has graciously accepted my little outbursts from time to time. And I think that if we just keep pushing a little bit, we will get to where we need to go. So thanks very much, everybody.